Welcome to the fourth installment of O.P. Jindal Lectures. I'm Ashutosh Varshne, Director of the Brown India Initiative and Professor of Political Science. These lectures were endowed in perpetuity by Brown parents Sajjan and Sangeeta Jindal in the memory of Sajjan's father, O.P. Jindal, an industrialist, a philanthropist, and also a politician from the northern Indian state of Haryana. The purpose of these lectures is to promote here at Brown a discussion of politics, economics, social and cultural change in modern India. The first three Jindal lecturers were Kaushik Basu on India's economy, Ashley Tellis on India's security, and Ram Guha on Mahatma Gandhi. The lecturer this week, today and Friday, is Ashis Nandy. The larger theme is partition violence of these two lectures. Today's lecture is entitled Forgetting the Unforgettable, Memories of a Killing. Introducing Ashis is both easy and hard. It is easy because I've known him for over 2 decades, and I've had the pleasure of his friendship. It is also hard because he defies easy professional categorization. He was trained as a clinical psychologist, but he also has intimate familiarity with social, political, and anthropological theories, and at one stage in his life, he even taught statistics. He ranges widely, as you can imagine, picks big themes for inquiry, lets his intellectual curiosity lead him to wherever he should go in search of explanations. And this pursuit of restless curiosity leads him, restless creativity, in the end produces insights, arguments, images, and narratives that last and shape the inquiry of others for years to come. It is best to call, in my view, such a mind a pioneering mind. Among the many intellectual contributions Ashish has made, I'd like to list 2 in particular today. I may speak about some other contributions on Friday. And the first one that I would like to call your attention to is his very influential book, The Intimate Enemy: Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism, first published in 1983 and still widely read all over the world. It's been in print for over 3 decades. The Intimate Enemy started with the claim that the political economy of colonialism, while not insignificant, was not as interesting or not as researched as the psychology that colonialism sought to create, not only for the colonized, but also for the colonial masters. The focus in the end was on Mahatma Gandhi and how he sought to answer a deeply significant question, namely, how should one reclaim self-respect in conditions of colonial subjugation? What cultural resources were available and could be deployed in that pursuit? A second big Nandi idea, something that intellectually shook me when I was working on Hindus and Muslims, was his critique of secularism. To put it briefly, mercilessly briefly, we don't have as much time today as on Friday, Ashish basically argued that secularism, despite its commitment to religious peace, can actually lead to a lot of religious violence. Recovery of pre-modern religious traditions, if possible, would in all likelihood be more aligned with peace than a pursuit of secularism. A whole new line of inquiry was thereby inaugurated. Today he speaks to us on a body of work that he has been engaged in for the last 10 years, perhaps a bit more. In the late 1990s, he came up with the idea that the generation that directly witnessed partition violence of 1947-48 would be around only for another 10 to 15 years. By interviewing them, this generation, by accessing their memories, much that is new can be learned. More than 1,500, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, more than 1,500 interviews were conducted with those who witnessed partition violence directly, and some who even confessed to perpetrating it. Ashish will speak to us for 45 minutes. My colleague Wazira Zamidar will then comment for 10 to 15 minutes. Her own book, some years ago, The Long Partition in the Making of Modern South Asia, also dealt with partition violence and examined not only the archives, but also collected narratives of those who had witnessed violence. Please welcome Ashish Nandy.
Ashis, you want me to come there, or should I speak from here?
It's up to you. This may be,
Up
to you.
If that is all right, I will speak from here. I'm a Bengali. I feel always more comfortable sitting. I think better. Because these are going to be 2 lectures, I will try to avoid repeating myself. So, though it is not very fair on those who might come to the second lecture and are not here today, I shall very briefly say something very general about the nature of partition and violence first, very quickly, in the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And I shall try to speak in telegraphies to save time. If I have time, I will elaborate on some of the themes a little more later on. I shall try, but I don't promise that. First, a personal note. I started my life as a student of medicine, then changed to sociology, and then to psychology while working in a psychoanalytic clinic, which also reaffirmed what you might call the clinical gaze. And when I study violence, it is that gaze which often comes back to me as a part of the repertoire. But unfortunately, I have found that that is not liked by very many. A clinical gaze cannot make an empirical study of a case, of a person you are studying or investigating, dependent on the law of probability. I didn't phrase it right, let me put it again. Try again. A clinical gaze does not allow you to say that this particular patient has only 5% chance of survival. So it will be better for the society and the family and the medical system to save our efforts for more deserving cases which are likely to survive. You are supposed to look at the case on its own, and even if the chance is less than 5%, you are supposed to struggle. And to do that, you have to identify what are the resources and strengths there is in the person you are studying. And my effort throughout my work on violence, on which I have worked for the last 45 years, has been to try to locate the strength and resources available to a society or a culture or a person to confront the violence. That's my. Unfortunately, I have found that in social sciences, that gaze is called a romantic and retrogressive vision, because invariably it also means that you look into the sources of in culture and community, and this does not give you a very as grim a picture of a genocide as many would like to have. When we started this work, it was the 50th anniversary of India's independence, and a drove of journalists from all over the world came to Delhi. And many of them landed at our center, at my office, because they had heard that I'm doing this study. And invariably, they asked for some idea of what kind of things we were finding. So I would say to them, all right, tell me what kind of thing you are looking for, because it is a largish team with something like 30 persons involved, so I can choose the right person to whom you could go. The answer in most of the cases can be put in 4 or 5 words. They said, tell us the goriest stories. So I am not going to tell you the goriest stories. I will start from the other end. What are the redeeming features? What are the features which you do not expect when you are studying a genocide? And for that, there are very few precedents, I must say, I have found. Only now, recently, some people are concentrating on rescuers. But when we started, there was 1 or 2 stray persons who had studied this problem. So that's one. The second part of personal history I want to mention here is this, that I was 9 when partition violence began. And when I studied partition violence, I was 60 or so. I found soon that there was a new interest in that violence. And I had to first face this problem, that why was I the oldest person studying partition violence, and why has not my cohorts have not studied it earlier? That part of the story I will not say, but this was something I had to look into. And the silence about partition is a very important part of the work I have done. And this silence, I have found now, is not unique to this genocide. One could even stick one's neck out and say that it takes at least 1.5 generations for some of the more lasting works on genocide to come out. The early works of people like Erich Fromm and Bruno Bettelheim, people have more or less forgotten, though they were interesting in themselves. But if you compare the work of some of the later workers with that, you will find the later works with some distance from it, much more interesting. And indeed, I found out that the more interesting works on the partition violence in South Asia was been done by people who had never seen the violence. They were too young to have seen it. In fact, these two women started it, Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon, and the ones who first did it, and Saida Khan, Lahore. They are the first ones to start this. And it is a fact that there is this. I mean, just to give you one example, the famous pioneering psychoanalyst in India who started the psychoanalytic movement in India, a personal friend of Freud who got analyzed by Freud himself through letters, of all things. G.S. Bose stayed in Calcutta in a house which was surrounded by slums, which were some of the first to break into rioting. He must have been able to see from his home, because our home was also quite close to that. Must have been able to see from his home houses burning. Must have seen at least some strange instances of violence directly. He himself was interested in the problem of violence, took special interest in Gandhi's non-violence as a solution to violence, but did not write a word on the subject. He was a prolific writer too, but did not write a word on it. That is something also we have to confront and deal with. And the third personal thing I would like to mention is this, that the more interesting theoretical issues arose after we had gone to the field with a schedule or a questionnaire, and after we had started interviewing people. So the study, in some sense, was rendered somewhat backdated by our findings themselves. So there is kind of built-in contradiction here. Anyway, I don't want to spend more time on that. But in addition to these personal reasons, I will like to very briefly now mention a few of the salient findings of the overall study, which might be of some interest and sets the context of the two cases I will discuss. The idea of partition as a source of violence was not there for the simple reason that this kind of partitioning was not there in history. All the 4 instances of partition in the 20th century were done by one party. It was colonial Britain. The 4 partitions which they imposed on them as a solution of possible violence themselves led to violence and led to continuous bloodletting for decades. All the 4 partitions. Ireland, Cyprus, Palestine, and India. All the 4. There were other cases where they have done, map mapping was their professional interest, I can put it that way. If you look at the maps of Africa and West Asia, you will find many straight lines And I don't have to tell you that the map itself tells you the story to some extent, that this kind of straight lines, and if you look at the maps, you know that it takes some degree of arrogance and self-confidence to embark on a human engineering at that scale, where you decide the fate of communities and the borders of countries and societies overnight through an intellectual and political exercise. That kind of self-confidence probably earlier imperial powers did not have. It is only in the 19th century that human beings acquired that self-confidence and impose that kind of a solution of peoples they have ruled over. So that is one. So the South Asian partition is one partition of the four. And I will also suggest to you that this partitioning, this pastime of partitioning, or finding partisan a solution to human problems, can only have come from a worldview and an attitude to human engineering, if I may call it so, which is post-enlightenment, which comes from a hard, material, positivist assumptions, and which presumes that some communities, some cultures of governance know better than the governed what to do with the lives of the governed. All the bloodletting stopped. All these four cases, the bloodletting has stopped, one can say, only when the contesting sides got tired of the bloodletting. At least in one case, it has still not stopped, but because the two sides are still not that tired, I presume. And gradually, when I studied the two theaters of war in South Asia, Punjab and Bengal, where most of the killings took place, I became aware of something that made me look beyond South Asia to find out. And not only in the other case of partition, but also in some of the measures, very well-studied situations of violence, genocide, if you like. That perhaps the goriest accounts of violence come not from places where the two communities involved in the violence are strangers, but are very closely intertwined, culturally and psychologically. And for some reason, there is a rupture, and that relationship has become now a poison gift. And this disturbed me to no end, because I had read Ashis' thing, where the relationship, he talks of associations between communities and how they protect you against violence. But I am not talking actually of political, economic, and social relationships only. I am talking of the psychological situation where two communities are so close that they cannot define themselves without the other community, where your self-definition is incomplete without the other. And where that intertwining or introjection of each other in some sense, has come to a state where you are seeking some kind of an exorcism. Exorcism. In fact, while doing this study, I began to relook at some of the better studied instances of violence, like the European Holocaust. And by the way, the term used in India for genocide is the same as Holocaust. So forgive if I use it for both. I mean, because many Israeli scholars do not like the fact that you are using Holocaust, but we cannot help it. I mean, this is what the actual respondents also say in India, the pralaya. It was like a pralaya. So this, I think, is a crucial clue why the violence in Punjab, for instance, in the South Asian case, took that horrendous form. It became a kind of an exorcism because the other side is present both as a temptation and a possibility. And you try to cleanse yourself of that temptation and that possibility. And this was probably the case in Germany too, to some extent, because German Jews were supposed to be the most integrated Jewish community in Europe. But I will let it pass at the moment. That's not what I'm trying to say. But this also means that we have to confront